Forcinder. Lights of 9B. The evening shifts at Cedar Grove Nursing Home had always been quiet, a time when the world seemed to pause. As I introduced Tom, the new nursing student, to our routine, I mentioned, "This is apartment 9B. Mrs. Lillian lived here until she passed away a few weeks ago." Tom paused by the door, curiosity etched on his face. "Did she die in here?" he asked. "No, but her presence still feels strong," I said, half in jest. We moved on, but the flicker of concern in Tom's eyes was unmistakable. That evening, as Tom and I made our routine checks, the corridors of Cedar Grove Nursing Home were quiet, almost too quiet. As we approached apartment 9B, the air seemed to thicken, charged with an unspoken anticipation. Tom paused, his hand hesitating on the doorknob before pushing the door open. Inside, the room was dimly lit by the fading evening light filtering through the curtains. The moment we stepped over the threshold, a distinct chill swept through the room, as if we had walked into an invisible cloud of cold air. Tom rubbed his arms, looking around uneasily. "Feels like a fridge in here," he muttered. I nodded, trying to mask my discomfort with a half-hearted smile. "Old buildings, you know. They have their quirks." As we moved further into the room, the overhead light flickered violently, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls. It was as if the light was struggling to maintain its grip against an unseen force. Tom glanced up, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "That doesn't look like just an electrical issue," he said, his voice tinged with doubt. Before I could reply, a sudden gust of wind rattled the windows, despite them being firmly closed and the evening being particularly still. The curtains billowed as if breathing, and a low, almost imperceptible moan seemed to echo through the room. It was a sound that neither of us could place, a whisper from the corners that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "Did you hear that?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, unable to find a rational explanation. "Let's check the rest of the room," I suggested, more for a lack of anything better to do than from a desire to investigate further. As we inspected the room, every step seemed to provoke a creak from the floorboards, louder than before, as if the very room was speaking to us. When Tom opened the closet, a sudden drop in temperature greeted us, and a faint, sweet scent, unplaceable but disturbingly familiar, filled the air. "It smells like, perfume," Tom questioned, sniffing the air. "Old, like it's been here for ages." "Mrs. Lillian's, perhaps," I mused, trying not to think about how the scent could have lingered so long after her passing. We finished our inspection with more questions than answers. As we left apartment 9B, I couldn't shake the feeling that something remained just out of sight, watching us from the shadows we'd left behind. The door closed with a definitive thud, and the light flickered one last time as if bidding us a foreboding farewell. When Mrs. Edith moved into apartment 9B, the transformation was both swift and disturbing. Initially, she was the picture of elderly grace, gentle and somewhat forgetful, her conversation scattered with memories of a long life well lived. But within days of her moving into Mrs. Lillian's former apartment, subtle changes began to manifest. The first sign was her sudden aversion to darkness. Previously indifferent to evening shadows, Mrs. Edith began to insist on keeping every light on, her voice trembling as she pleaded with the staff. "Please don't let it get dark. I can't stand the dark," she would say, a stark contrast to her usual mild-mannered tone. This was particularly chilling because it echoed Mrs. Lillian's well-known fear, a detail Tom and I knew all too well. Tom and I were passing by her room late one evening when we heard her speaking softly to someone, though she was alone. "No, I don't want to sleep yet. They might come if I close my eyes," she whispered, her voice quivering with a palpable fear. It was unsettling, Hearing her speak like this, her words mirroring those we'd read in Mrs. Lillian's diary entries about her own tormented nights. As the days progressed, Mrs. Edith's personality seemed to warp further. She began to adopt phrases and expressions that were characteristically Mrs. Lillian's. One afternoon, I overheard her scolding a nurse, and with a sharpness that was entirely uncharacteristic, using turns of phrase that Mrs. Lillian had often used. "This isn't how we do things here," she snapped, her finger wagging in the air, her demeanor assertive and strangely authoritative. Even her habits changed. Mrs. Edith, who had never cared much for television, now spent hours in front of it, watching old black and white films, a pastime Mrs. Lillian had cherished. She also started to refuse certain foods, dismissing them with a wave of her hand and declaring, "I never liked that, never have," despite having enjoyed them just weeks before. Tom and I witnessed these changes with growing alarm. It was one evening, as we discussed her condition in hushed tones outside her door, that we heard her singing a lullaby. The song was old, one Mrs. Lillian had hummed often as she wandered the halls of Cedar Grove. Mrs. Edith's voice carried through the door, eerie and out of place, as if it wasn't quite her own. "We need to do something," Tom insisted, his face pale under the flickering lights of the hallway. "She's not just sick, Mark. It's like she's being overwritten." I nodded, deeply unsettled by the accuracy of his description. The changes in Mrs. Edith were too aligned with Mrs. Lillian's personality and past, suggesting something far beyond mere coincidence or medical issues. It was clear that whatever lingered in apartment 9B was affecting her, pulling her into a vortex of a past life that wasn't her own. Inspired by Tom's insistence, we searched 9B more thoroughly one evening. Hidden under a loose floorboard, Tom found Mrs. Lillian's diary. The entries revealed her tormented soul. She had been the secret lover of a wealthy businessman, Mr. Benson, and the children she cared for and ultimately poisoned were her own, born from their hidden affair. The diary detailed her despair when Mr. Benson married another, her dreadful act of poisoning their children to prevent them from becoming part of his public life, and her subsequent flight. "I live each day with their screams haunting me," she wrote. "I know they'll never let me rest, not after what I've done." The phenomena in 9B grew more intense each night. Lights turned on by themselves, and Mrs. Edith's personality shifts grew more pronounced. "She's becoming someone else, someone like Mrs. Lillian," Tom observed grimly. "We can't ignore this anymore," I decided. "It's time to get help." Mrs. Edith's family confronted us, their faces etched with worry and fear. "She's changing before our eyes," her son explained, desperation in his voice. "It's like she's possessed." "We've reached out to a specialist," I assured them. "She's helped with cases like this before." Kirsten arrived at Cedar Grove just as dusk was giving way to the deep blue of early evening. She had an ethereal quality about her, with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing. Her hair was a cascade of silver waves, and she moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the unknown countless times and emerged unscathed. She was greeted at the door by Tom and me, her gaze sweeping over us and then the building with a measured, almost calculating precision. "Thank you for having me," she said, her voice clear and composed. "Let's not waste any time. Show me to the room." As we walked towards apartment 9B, Kirsten paused occasionally, her senses attuned to the subtle shifts in the environment. Upon entering, she took a deep breath, absorbing the atmosphere. "There's a heavy residue of grief and guilt here," she observed, setting down her bag of tools, which included sage, candles, and a small, leather-bound book of her own. Tom handed her Mrs. Lillian's diary, which she opened with a reverence for the words it held. Flipping through the pages, she stopped at a particularly worn entry and began to read aloud, her voice echoing slightly in the dimly lit room. "March 15th, 1965. Today I felt the weight of my sins crushing me anew. I have done the unthinkable, condemned by my own hand those innocent souls who trusted me." Mr. Benson will marry soon, and my heart breaks not just for my loss but for the lives I took in my despair. May God have mercy on me, for I cannot forgive myself." Kirsten closed the diary slowly, her eyes not leaving the page. Mrs. Lillian was trapped in a cycle of remorse so profound that it has anchored her to this world. She explained, her tone somber. Her spirit lingers because she believes she deserves this purgatory, this eternal night without solace or forgiveness. She set the diary down and began to arrange her tools around the room, creating a makeshift altar at the center. We need to break this cycle. Her children, the ones she wronged and mourns, they are key. If we can help her accept their forgiveness, perhaps then she can find peace. Kirsten lit a candle and placed it on the altar, the flame flickering slightly as if in response to her words. Tonight, we will reach out to Mrs. Lillian. We will try to bring her the peace she could not find in life, through understanding and compassion. As she spoke, it was clear Kirsten was not just a medium but a healer, someone who walked in both worlds, guiding lost souls to their rest. Tom and I listened, the gravity of our task settling around us like a cloak. Kirsten's presence brought a new sense of hope, and her plan outlined a path that might just lead Mrs. Lillian out of her darkness. The room was set, candles flickering as shadows played across the walls of apartment 9B. Kirsten began her ritual with an air of solemn authority, spreading salt in a circle around us as a protective barrier. Tom and I stood by her side, a mix of fear and resolve stealing our nerves. "Mrs. Lillian, we call upon you to hear our words." Kirsten started, her voice echoing slightly in the still room. "This pain, this fear does not need to be your eternity." The temperature dropped suddenly, a cold so deep it seemed to seep into our bones. Tom shivered beside me, his eyes wide but determined. "We're here to help you," he added, his voice stronger than I expected. "You don't have to suffer alone." From the darkness a voice emerged, a distorted echo of Mrs. Lillian's once kind tone, now twisted with malice. "Leave me be. This is my place. My punishment." Kirsten held out a small old photograph of Mrs. Lillian's children, her hand steady despite the chilling air. "You hurt because you loved, and yes, you made terrible choices. But keeping you from peace won't change the past. Your children don't want this for you." The room seemed to pulse with energy, the candles flickering wildly as if caught in an unseen storm. They were mine to love, mine to punish. The spirit wailed, the sorrow and rage palpable in the air. "It wasn't love, Mrs. Lillian. What you did was out of pain, not love," Tom countered passionately. "And we're here to release you from that pain. Let go of the hate, let go of the fear. Your children have forgiven you. It's time for you to forgive yourself." Kirsten resumed chanting, her words now a powerful incantation that filled the room with a vibrating energy. I could feel the hairs on my arms stand up as the air thickened, the boundary between our world and the next thinning dangerously. "Mrs. Lillian, by the power vested in me, I command you to cross over," Kirsten declared, her voice booming. "Release yourself from this torment and move towards the light." The spirit screamed, a sound so heart-wrenching and desperate that it momentarily froze us in place. Then, as quickly as it had escalated, the tension in the room began to dissipate. The air warmed slightly, the oppressive presence that had haunted apartment 9B lifting. Tom let out a long breath, his relief visible. "Is it over?" he whispered. Kirsten nodded, slowly lowering her arms. "Her spirit is free. She's crossed over." I looked around the now peaceful apartment, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. We had faced the darkness and come out stronger. In the aftermath, the room felt lighter, almost peaceful. Mrs. Edith woke confused but calm. "What happened?" she asked softly. "It's over now," I reassured her, relief washing over me. Tom looked around, his eyes wide with the realization of what we had achieved. "It's really over," he whispered. Chapter 10. New Beginnings. The events of that night left a deep imprint on all of us, particularly on Tom. In the days that followed, he grew contemplative, distant at times. One evening, as we walked the quiet halls of Cedar Grove, he spoke up. "Mark, I've been thinking a lot about what happened in 9B, about what we faced, and what I learned." "And?" I prompted, sensing his unrest. "I think my path is different now," he said with a resolve I hadn't seen before. "I need to leave. I need to write about this, about everything we experienced. People need to know." I nodded, understanding his need to process and share our story in his own way. "You're going to be great, Tom. Just don't forget us when you're a best-selling author." He smiled, a bit sadly. "How could I? This place, what we did, it's going to be the heart of my book." We parted ways not long after that night. Tom moved on, dedicated to his writing, and true to his word, his book became a bestseller. Titled Lights of 9B, it delved into the dark corners of human experiences with the paranormal, telling our story with a raw honesty that captivated readers worldwide. As for me, I continued at Cedar Grove, my days filled with the normal challenges of nursing. But the nights were different. I often paused by the door of 9B, now always quiet, always dark, and I'd think about Tom, about Kirsten, and the thin veil between our world and the next. Tom's book opened many doors for him, and he often spoke at conferences and interviews, discussing his experiences and the deeper implications of our encounters with the supernatural. While he explored the realms of authorship and public speaking, I kept in touch, always proud of how he used his experiences to enlighten others. In a way, the events in Apartment 9B changed us both, setting us on paths we'd never expected to walk. For Tom, it was a journey of storytelling and reflection. For me, it was a deeper understanding of the mysteries that might lie just beyond, always reminding me that there's much in this world that remains beyond our understanding, waiting to be explored.